On the 14th of July, 1941, Wehrmacht troops stationed in the Orca rail facility witnessed an event that would terrorize German forces for years to come. Out of nowhere, the heavens erupted. A barrage of 112 missiles screamed earthward from the blue. Their fiery contrails slashed across the dawn sky. The noise defied description, a shrieking, keening symphony that appeared to originate from every direction simultaneously. After the bombardment ceased 10 seconds afterward, the facility had vanished. Railroad cars, transport vehicles, armored vehicles, supply depots, everything became a nightmare landscape of mangled steel and dying soldiers. Those who remained abandoned their posts in terror. They were unaware they had just become the first victims of the Katyusha multiple rocket system, armament so classified that NKVD personnel accompanied its operators with instructions to destroy it completely rather than permit enemy capture. These weapons had received manufacturing authorization just 1 day before German armies crossed the frontier. A mere 40 units existed at the invasion's start. Leading that initial test unit of 7 systems, Captain Ivan Flerov would perish 3 months afterward at Smolensk, executing precisely what his instructions required, destroying his equipment before German troops arrived, carrying himself and state secrets into oblivion. German armoured columns had pressed forward 500 kilometres in merely 18 days following their border crossing. Their velocity was breathtaking. They had advanced more rapidly than Napoleon's celebrated army, more rapidly than any military force in recorded history. On the 27th of July, mechanised vanguards would execute yet another classic pincer manoeuvre, joining forces beyond Smolensk, precisely as they had at Minsk, precisely as their tactics in France had demonstrated 12 months prior. Wehrmacht formations now positioned themselves merely 400 kilometres from the Soviet capital, near enough that planning officers could measure the gap in days instead of weeks, near enough to sense triumph. They would advance no farther. Events at Smolensk during July through September 1941 would determine Germany's defeat, converting a battlefield success into an operational disaster that destroyed rapid warfare. This represents the chronicle of combat history overlooked, not due to insignificance, but because its genuine impact has been obscured beneath the better-known catastrophes at Stalingrad and Kursk. When those engagements occurred, Germany had already sealed its fate. The actual decisive moment arrived here during summer 1941 on the historic route to the Soviet capital that Napoleon's forces had once travelled. The Wehrmacht strategy was beautifully straightforward. Heinz Guderian's armoured formation would ford the Dnieper from the southern approach, while Hermann Hoth's mechanised group descended from the northern sector. The paired armoured claws would converge beyond Smolensk, ensnaring Soviet forces protecting the approach to the capital in an enormous trap. This was the identical approach that had demolished Poland in 4 weeks and France in 6. Nothing suggested it would fail this time. On the 10th of July, Guderian initiated his unexpected crossing of the Dnieper. His troops overwhelmed the undermanned Soviet 13th Army in hours, shattering defences that scarcely existed. On the 13th of July, his advance elements, the 29th Motorized Formation, had already reached 18 kilometres from Smolensk. The drive appeared irresistible. 3 days afterward, reinforced by the 17th Panzer Formation, they penetrated the city proper, securing the majority of it in a rapid strike that appeared to validate German beliefs about their dominance. What came next was anticipated to require days. It consumed weeks. Wehrmacht commanders assessed they confronted 11 Soviet formations near Smolensk. Their reconnaissance had disastrously misled them. Due to Stalin's frantic choice to deploy essentially the complete strategic reserve to this area, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko actually led 66 formations, along with substantial reserves still moving from the heartland. Wehrmacht leadership had no understanding of what awaited them in the woodlands and wetlands surrounding the historic city. The 29th Motorized secured the majority of Smolensk on the 16th of July, yet the outskirts held firm. For 7 full days, Wehrmacht soldiers waged building-to-building warfare against persistent strikes from the Soviet 16th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mikhail Lukin. Red Army troops materialized from basements and upper floors, assaulted logistics convoys on woodland paths, targeted couriers, and lone machines. Marksmen eliminated commanders with chilling precision. This wasn't Poland. This wasn't France. Their adversaries continued combat when surrender seemed logical, continued assaulting when withdrawal seemed prudent, continued perishing rather than yielding territory. General Gotthard Heinrizi, leading Wehrmacht foot soldiers in the area, corresponded home with obvious alarm. The enemy is exceptionally powerful and battles with suicidal determination. They materialize unexpectedly all across the sector, firing, descending upon convoys, solitary machines, couriers. Our casualties are substantial. What Wehrmacht forces were facing was something unprecedented, an adversary that disregarded the conventions of European warfare as they recognized it, an adversary that preferred death to submission. On the 15th of July, the mechanized pincers of both armored groups had almost sealed the trap. Merely 16 kilometers divided them, barely 10 miles. One additional effort and the pocket would close, capturing 3 Soviet forces, the 16th, 19th, and 20th, comprising nearly 400,000 troops. It appeared a straightforward matter of joining forces. German armor had accomplished it previously numerous times. Then, Stalin reached a choice that would help preserve the capital. Lieutenant General Konstantin Rokossovsky had recently landed in the Soviet capital from Ukraine, still bearing bodily marks of 3 years in the Gulag. Secret police torturers had extracted 9 of his molars and fractured 3 of his ribs during interminable interrogation about fabricated offences. He had been freed only because the Red Army desperately required seasoned leaders. Most others had been eliminated in Stalin's purges of the late 30s, casualties of the identical paranoia that had nearly killed Rokossovsky himself. Now this scarred survivor was instantly sent to halt the seemingly unstoppable. Timoshenko assigned him leadership of something designated Group Yartsevo, an organization that existed on paper alone, a frantic improvisation created from necessity. Rokossovsky subsequently remembered his initial assignment with harsh irony. The command staff provided me with 2 vehicles mounting quadruple defensive machine weapons with operators, a communications vehicle, and a tiny group of commanders. That was everything. 2 vehicles against 2 armored groups. He departed the capital with a small group to stop the greatest war machine on the planet. It appeared suicidal, yet Rokossovsky was gifted, seasoned, and completely desperate. He assembled withdrawing survivors along the highway from the capital to Yartsevo, halting every machine, incorporating every soldier he could locate into his makeshift force. He gathered the 101st Armored Formation, the 107th Mechanized Formation, pieces from the destroyed 44th Infantry Corps. Withdrawing regiments and formations escaping from the Smolensk pocket were assigned to his authority. New units arrived slowly from the reserves. Gradually, continuously, he built a combat force from the ruins of the front line. When the 7th Panzer Formation, the renowned ghost unit that had raced across France, attempted to seal the opening at Yartsevo, Rokossovsky's improvised group halted them completely. For 14 days, his assembled force maintained an escape route barely 16 kilometers across, a slender lifeline through which portions of 3 Soviet forces could evacuate the collapsing pocket. The combat in this confined space between Smolensk and Yartsevo descended into savage close quarters fighting with both armies, enduring catastrophic losses in hand-to-hand struggle. On the 24th of July, Rokossovsky's troops briefly expelled Germans from Yartsevo. German forces retook it. Rokossovsky's soldiers reclaimed it. On the 29th of July, his 101st Armored Formation recovered the settlement after suffering horrific casualties in personnel and equipment. On the 30th of July, Rokossovsky's group at last penetrated through to the 2 surrounded Soviet forces trapped at Smolensk. At that point, certain formations were reduced to fewer than 2,000 soldiers apiece, scarcely the size of a peacetime regiment. The situation at the Dnieper crossings became pandemonium. A frantic evacuation with troops literally rushing the spans to escape. Support personnel evacuated initially, frequently leaving valuable supplies and machines. Yet over subsequent days, relative organization was re-established, and the majority of the survivors from the 16th and 20th forces crossed to the eastern riverbank. Rokossovsky is acknowledged with delaying the Wehrmacht assault sufficiently to avert the seizure of potentially hundreds of thousands of extra Soviet soldiers. Troops who would be rebuilt and returned into the struggle for the capital in the critical months approaching. Germans still achieved the encirclement. During late July, the Smolensk pocket was formally sealed. Yet sealed didn't mean eliminated. The success that appeared so absolute on command charts was considerably messier on the battlefield. Within the pocket, Soviet troops refused to perish swiftly. They struck from inside, while new forces struck from outside. Timoshenko initiated continuous offensives beginning the 21st of July, sending the recently mobilized 24th, 28th, 29th and 30th forces against Wehrmacht defensive lines. These organizations had been raised merely days or weeks before, poorly instructed conscripts commanded by green officers, under-equipped, and frequently missing basic armament. They struck regardless, throwing themselves against Wehrmacht positions in attacks that appeared reckless, yet never ceased arriving. The losses were disastrous on both sides, yet particularly for the Soviets. Red Army casualties for the complete Smolensk campaign would total roughly 760,000 troops, nearly 500,000 slain, seized or disappeared, plus an additional 270,000 injured. Wehrmacht forces seized somewhere between 300,000 and 565,000 captives, depending on which tally you accept and how you establish the parameters of the engagement. Yet Germans bled as well, and unlike the Soviets, they couldn't replenish their casualties. Army Group Center experienced roughly 115,000 losses between the 10th of July and the 10th of September, dead and wounded that the Wehrmacht could never adequately replace. These weren't raw conscripts, yet seasoned troops, survivors of Poland and France, the foundation of the Wehrmacht apparatus. Numerous panzer formations were reduced to fewer than 50% of their designated armor strength. Approximately 200 tanks were demolished beyond salvage. Not by superior Red Army armor, yet by mechanical failures, by defensive guns, by the pure grinding of persistent battle. Munitions ran dangerously low. Petroleum ran out completely in certain formations, immobilizing machines that should have been advancing toward the capital. At Yelnia, about 70 kilometers to Smolensk's southeast, Guderian's 10th Panzer Formation captured a position on the 19th of July that was intended to be the launching point for the ultimate thrust on the capital. The elevated ground around Yelnia controlled the adjacent landscape, ideal terrain for initiating the next stage of the advance. Instead, the position became a festering wound that would sap Wehrmacht power for 6 weeks. Germans ran out of petroleum arriving there. They nearly ran out of munitions defending it. For 6 weeks, Wehrmacht troops clung to the Yelnia bulge, while Red Army strikes pounded them continuously, without pause. The 10th Panzer Formation, the SS Das Reich Formation, portions of multiple infantry formations, all were consumed into the slaughterhouse of Yelnia, and all emerged weakened. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, leading Army Group Center, recorded in mounting exasperation. I was now compelled to deploy all of my operational formations from the Army Group's reserve into battle. We required every soldier forward. Despite enormous casualties, the adversary struck daily in multiple areas, so that until now, it has not been feasible to reorganize troops and advance reserves. The force that had defeated France in 6 weeks could no longer progress in Russia. The apparatus was stopping completely. On the 27th of July, von Bock gathered his leaders at his base in Novi Borisov for what became one of the most heated gatherings of the conflict. Also attending were Walther von Brauchitsch, Wehrmacht Supreme Commander, and Franz Halder, Army Command Staff Leader. What should have been a standard operational discussion deteriorated into something approaching open rebellion against Adolf Hitler personally. Hitler had already indicated his plan to redirect troops away from the capital. Führer Order 33, released the 14th of July, refocused the primary Wehrmacht thrust toward Ukraine southward and Leningrad northward. The commanders were appalled. The capital was merely 400 kilometers distant. The route was clear, or at minimum it had been before Smolensk. Winter was approaching, and every commander present understood what that signified. Every day of postponement was a day the Soviets could utilize to construct defenses, transfer reinforcements from Siberia, recuperate from their disastrous casualties in the frontier engagements. Guderian documented in his personal record that Hitler favored a strategy by which limited adversary troops were to be surrounded and eliminated gradually, and the adversary thus exhausted gradually. The Führer was more concerned with industrial objectives, the wheat of Ukraine, the petroleum of the Caucasus, the manufacturing of the Donbass, than in seizing the Soviet seat of government. Every commander present considered this was a disastrous error. The capital was the center. Remove the center, and the organism expires. Yet what could they do? Hitler was the ultimate authority. He rendered the choices. He had rendered all the choices that had transported them from the Rhine to the Dnieper in merely 2 years. Who were they to challenge his brilliance now? What occurred next astonished even veteran Wehrmacht officers. The commanders chose to resist their Führer. Following returning to their posts, Guderian, Hoth, and Bock plotted to postpone the execution of Order 33, which meant openly defying the explicit commands of Adolf Hitler personally. Guderian rapidly constructed a strategy for persistent offensive actions toward the capital, scheduled to commence the 1st of August. The commanders would submit Hitler with a concluded appeal, compel his decision, thrust on the capital whether he sanctioned or not. Then arrived Führer Order 34, released the 30th of July. Hitler recognized the circumstances that his commanders had been attempting to conceal from him, the circumstances that Smolensk had exposed. The progression of the circumstances in the recent days, he recorded, the manifestation of powerful adversary troops on the front line and to the flanks of Army Group Center, the logistics condition, and the necessity to provide 2nd and 3rd Armored Groups roughly 10 days to restore their formations, make it essential to delay for the present the additional assignments and goals. 10 days to restore. The armoured groups that had traversed complete nations in weeks now required 10 days merely to recuperate from Smolensk. The invincible Wehrmacht was depleted. The hemorrhaging surrounding the historic gateway settlement had at last caught up with them, and even Hitler could perceive it. On the 11th of August, Franz Halder settled down to document his reflections in his conflict diary. What he recorded would prove prophetic. The entire circumstances makes it progressively evident that we have miscalculated the Russian giant. Red Army, formations are not supplied and outfitted according to our specifications, and their battlefield command is frequently inadequate. Yet there they are, and after destroying dozens of them, the Russians merely establish another dozen. They are adjacent to their own supplies while we are advancing farther and farther from ours, and so our soldiers distributed over an enormous front line without any reserve are exposed to the constant strikes of the adversary. At the beginning of Barbarossa, Wehrmacht reconnaissance had calculated the Soviet Union maintained roughly 200 formations. During August, they had already tallied 360, an additional kept materializing from nowhere. From Siberia, from Central Asia, from instruction facilities that appeared inexhaustible, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, leading Army Group South, expressed it more directly. The enormity of Russia consumes us. The calculations of rapid warfare had collapsed completely. In Poland, surrounding the adversary force had meant achieving the conflict. In France, the identical. Yet in Russia, eliminating one force merely meant battling another that materialized from the limitless expanse of the Soviet heartland. The operational technique that had defeated Western Europe in weeks was deteriorating into a conflict of grinding attrition, precisely the variety of conflict Germany could not achieve. On the 30th of August, Georgy Zhukov, recently designated leader of the Reserve Front and already rising as Stalin's most relied-upon battlefield leader, initiated a synchronized assault against the Yelnya Bulge. For 10 days, the 24th Force and 43rd Force battered at Wehrmacht positions with everything they possessed. Red Army soldiers literally had to fight their way through Wehrmacht fortifications. Advancement was calculated in hundreds of meters, purchased with thousands of casualties. On the 3rd of September, under mounting danger of surrounding, Germans commenced withdrawing from the Bulge they had defended for 6 weeks. One Wehrmacht foot soldier recorded the harsh circumstances in his personal record. Formally, it was termed a strategic withdrawal, yet to me, it was complete nonsense. The following day, we learned through broadcasts about the triumphant frontline adjustment in our Yelnya fortified positions and the massive casualties we caused the adversary. Yet no individual mention was heard about a withdrawal, about the desperation of the circumstances, about the psychological and spiritual exhaustion of the Wehrmacht troops. In summary, it was again a success. Yet we on the frontline line were fleeing like prey before the predator. This transformation of the circumstances from all nonsense to it was a success puzzled me and those of my fellow soldiers who ventured to think. On the 8th of September, Red Army troops recaptured Yelnya. It was the initial substantial piece of land, recovered from Hitler's Wehrmacht anywhere in Europe since the conflict commenced, merely 100 to 150 square kilometers, a minuscule section of scorched settlements and churned soil that had required tens of thousands of casualties. Yet it was the initial instance since 1939 that the Wehrmacht had been compelled to surrender territory and maintain it surrendered. The combat at Yelnya had required the Wehrmacht 9th Army Corps over 23,000 losses. The 4th Force would not recuperate from these casualties for the remaining year. For what purpose? A position they couldn't maintain, a launching point to nowhere. To recognize the formations that had suffered and perished recovering that limited section of terrain, Soviet command established something unprecedented, the Guards classification. On the 18th of September, the 100th Infantry Formation was redesignated the 1st Guards Infantry Formation. The 127th became the 2nd Guards. Subsequently, the 107th and 120th would become the 5th and 6th Guards. The designation would become the supreme recognition a Red Army formation could obtain, a custom that would persist through the remaining conflict and afterward into the Soviet period. It was created in the filth and carnage of Smolensk. The engagement of Smolensk formally concluded on the 10th of September, 1941. It had persisted precisely 2 months, the 10th of July to the 10th of September, 2 months in which the Wehrmacht had progressed not toward the capital, but in loops surrounding Smolensk, hemorrhaging against Red Army strikes, expending irreplaceable troops and equipment, while duration, the most valuable asset of all, vanished with every passing day. Hitler then worsened matters. Instead of instantly resuming the capital thrust following Smolensk, he commanded Guderian's armoured groups southward to finalize the surrounding of Kiev in Ukraine. It was battlefield brilliant. The Kiev pocket produced 665,000 Red Army captives, the largest individual surrounding in warfare records. Wehrmacht information celebrated the accomplishment, yet it consumed another valuable month while the Russian autumn approached nearer. Operation Typhoon, the ultimate thrust on the capital, did not commence until the 2nd of October, 1941, more than 3 months following the capture of Smolensk. Initially, it succeeded spectacularly, duplicating all the triumphs of the summer offensive. Wehrmacht troops surrounded and eliminated several additional Soviet forces at Vyazma and Bryansk, seizing another 600,000 captives. The capital appeared within grasp. On the 15th of October, the Soviet administration commenced relocating to Kuybyshev on the Volga. Stalin remained in the fortress, yet the circumstances appeared desperate. Then arrived the Rasputitsa. On the 7th of October, the initial snowfall arrived, dissolving almost instantly and converting every highway into a torrent of sludge. Red Army troops had a designation for this period, Rasputitsa, which converts approximately as the season without highways. Wehrmacht transport vehicles sank to their frames and could not be extracted. Armour could scarcely advance and consumed valuable petroleum attempting. Horses perished by the thousands from pure exhaustion, hauling carts through the mire. The entire assault ground to a standstill in an ocean of adhesive black sludge that appeared to consume everything. On the 31st of October, Wehrmacht command mandated a total halt to assault actions. The force would await the terrain to solidify before attempting to advance again. There was merely no alternative option. The delay provided Zhukov valuable duration he utilized ruthlessly. While Germans awaited winter to solidify the terrain, Soviets transferred new formations from Siberia and the Far East. Combat-experienced soldiers outfitted for frigid conditions, numerous of them survivors of frontier clashes with Japan, who had never confronted the Wehrmacht. The postponement had provided Soviets duration to reinforce their fortifications with nearly 1 million extra soldiers and 1,000 new T-34 armour. Armour that Germans had uncovered, to their dismay, were nearly resistant to their conventional defensive armament. When the terrain at last solidified in mid-November, Germans struck again with everything they possessed remaining. The northern pincer penetrated within 30 kilometers of the fortress. Wehrmacht reconnaissance formations progressed to the settlement of Khimki, merely 30 kilometers from the center of the capital. A patrol from the 2nd Panzer Formation reportedly penetrated a location where commanders could observe the towers of the seat of government through their observation equipment. It was the nearest they would ever advance. On the 5th of December 1941, the climate plummeted to unprecedented lows. Certain accounts claimed 40 degrees below freezing. Wehrmacht soldiers, still dressed in warm season attire because winter garments had been delayed in Poland for absence of logistics precedents, commenced freezing to death in their positions. Over 130,000 instances of cold injury were documented. Armour power plants wouldn't initiate. Armaments wouldn't discharge. Troops who lost consciousness on sentry assignment never regained consciousness. That identical day, Soviets counterstruck. New Siberian formations collided into depleted Wehrmacht positions along the complete front line. These were not the inadequately instructed, poorly outfitted organizations that had been destroyed at Smolensk. These were survivors, troops who had devoted years protecting the Manchurian frontier against Japan, who understood how to battle in frozen conditions and frigidity, who arrived outfitted with appropriate winter equipment, while Wehrmacht troops wrapped themselves in confiscated coverings and inserted paper into their footwear. The Wehrmacht, which had not experienced substantial withdrawal since the conflict commenced more than 2 years prior, abruptly found itself retreating in disarray. Within weeks, Germans had been driven back over 100 kilometers in certain areas. The legend of Wehrmacht invincibility, meticulously developed since 1939, expired in the frozen landscape outside the capital. The capital was preserved, rapid warfare was finished, and the extended route to Berlin, a route that would require 27 million Soviet casualties, had commenced. The calculations of Smolensk are condemning when you present them plainly. The engagement persisted from the 10th of July to the 10th of September, precisely 2 months. Include the month redirected to Kiev through September and early October, and you obtain approximately 3 months of total postponement. Operation Typhoon commenced the 2nd of October and encountered headlong into the autumn sludge period by 7th of October, merely 5 days afterward. If the capital assault had commenced in late July or early August instead, as the commanders had implored Hitler to permit, the armour might have penetrated the seat of government before the Rasputitsa, before Red Army reinforcements materialized from Siberia, before the fortifications had duration to solidify into the slaughter zone that halted them. Even Hitler comprehended what had been forfeited. At Novi Borisov on the 27th of July, His commanders had implored him to permit them thrust on the capital instantly while drive was still on their advantage. He declined. During December, when his frozen forces were withdrawing through the frozen landscape, he had no option but to confront the results of that choice. Guderian subsequently recorded with harsh retrospection, Kiev was undoubtedly a spectacular battlefield triumph, yet the inquiry of whether it had a substantial operational significance still remains unanswered. Everything now relied on our capacity to accomplish anticipated outcomes before the winter and even before the autumn precipitation. They didn't accomplish those outcomes. They couldn't. Smolensk had already injured them too severely and expended too much valuable duration. The engagement of Smolensk required the Wehrmacht more than 115,000 losses, over 200 armoured vehicles eliminated beyond salvage, and 2 irreplaceable months of the offensive period. It depleted the armoured formations that were intended to seize the capital, formations that had been the piercing edge of the Wehrmacht blade, now dulled against Red Army opposition. It expended the petroleum, munitions, and replacement components that the progress on the seat of government would critically require. It destroyed the schedule that rapid warfare demanded to operate, the merciless timetable that required success before the adversary could recuperate, before winter could solidify the progress in its path, before the limitless supplies of the Russian heartland could be activated. The commanders had understood from the commencement that velocity was everything. Guderian personally had recorded before the engagement that if the armour did not penetrate their goals rapidly, whether the foot soldiers would then be capable to demolish a properly organised riverbank fortified position so that flexible warfare might once again be feasible, appeared uncertain. His uncertainties proved accurate. Flexible warfare expired at Smolensk, substituted by the grinding positional battle that Germany could never achieve. Red Army casualties were far worse in total figures: 760,000 losses, perhaps 500,000 seized or slain. Yet the Soviet Union could substitute those casualties from its enormous population of nearly 200 million individuals. Germany, with a population fewer than half that magnitude and already extended thin across occupied Europe, could not. The Red Army was battling adjacent to its own supplies, its own manufacturing facilities, its own population centres. The Wehrmacht was battling at the terminus of a logistics chain extending back thousands of kilometres to the Reich. Every projectile and every gallon of petroleum conveyed over highways that scarcely merit the designation. What Smolensk exposed was the lethal defect constructed into rapid warfare philosophy from the commencement. The approach was created for brief offensives against states that would crumble following decisive defeats. Poland had crumbled. France had crumbled. Even the powerful British realm had been expelled from the mainland. The Soviet Union declined to crumble. Every force eliminated was substituted by another force from the limitless reserves of Soviet population. Every surrounding produced captives, yet not success. The operational technique that had rendered Germany master of Europe was futile against an adversary that could tolerate unlimited punishment and persist battling. The Wehrmacht had the capacity to achieve engagements. It did not have the capacity to achieve this conflict. Captain Ivan Flerov, who had released those initial screaming Katyusha missiles at Orcha on the 14th of July, was deceased by October, trapped in and surrounding near the settlement of Bogatyr in the Smolensk territory. With his machines immobilized by wetland landscape and depleted of munitions, he mandated his classified armaments eliminated rather than permit them to fall into Wehrmacht possession. Critically wounded, Flerov detonated the primary system personally. Of his 170 troops, merely 46 escaped the surrounding. Germans never seized a single undamaged Katyusha, yet the missiles survived and multiplied. By conflict's conclusion, 10,000 Katyusha systems would operate in the Red Force. Their keening volleys would escort the Red Army progress from Stalingrad to the Vistula to the avenues of Berlin proper. Germans designated them Stalin's pipes for the noise they produced. The tubes organized like pipes. The missiles screaming like a death hymn. It was a lament for the Wehrmacht. initially heard in the rail facility at Orcha as the engagement of Smolensk commenced. British conflict correspondent Alexander Werth toured Yelnya shortly following its recapture in September 1941. He traversed through the remnants of a settlement that had once contained 15,000 inhabitants. Nearly all the capable men and females had been organized into compulsory labor units and transported to the Wehrmacht rear. Merely a few hundred elderly individuals and youngsters had been permitted to remain. On the evening before the Wehrmacht departed, survivors informed him they had been secured in the place of worship, while Wehrmacht troops methodically plundered the residences and ignited each one. Yet Werth observed something else in that devastation, something that exceeded the obliteration. He recorded, "Here was not only, as it were, the initial success of the Red Force over the Germans. Here was also the initial segment of land, perhaps only 100 to 150 square miles in the entirety of Europe, recovered from Hitler's Wehrmacht." It is peculiar to consider that in 1941, even that was regarded an accomplishment. It was more than an accomplishment. It was a prediction of what was to arrive. From this limited section of scorched soil would emerge a wave that would not halt until it penetrated Berlin. Smolensk is overlooked because it was neither straightforward success nor straightforward defeat. It was something more disturbing, an engagement that Germans achieved on the battlefield while forfeiting operationally, a success that masked a lethal injury. The armor seized the settlement. They captured their hundreds of thousands of captives. They communicated their triumph to Berlin, and then they suffered, depleted of petroleum and depleted of duration, while the highway to the capital vanished away permanently. Records acknowledge Stalingrad as the decisive moment, the instant when the wave reversed and Germany commenced its extended withdrawal to obliteration. Records acknowledge Kursk as the termination of Wehrmacht assault capacity, the final major armoured strike that collapsed against Red Army fortifications. Yet by the instant those engagements were waged, the conflict was already forfeited. The actual decisive moment arrived earlier in the summer of 1941, when the invincible Wehrmacht encountered an adversary that declined to be defeated in an engagement that ground rapid warfare into the Russian sludge. The armour had accomplished it again at Smolensk. Another flawless surrounding, another enormous quantity of captives, another success for Wehrmacht forces, and 220 miles from the capital, near enough to observe success, near enough to sense the conclusion. Of the Soviet Union, they uncovered that success would never arrive. If you appreciated this chronicle, select subscribe for additional World War II historical explorations every week. Thanks for watching.